In a world already on edge, Putin's latest gambit, a ramp-up of tactical nuclear weapons drills, sends shivers down the spine. Amidst the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, this chilling announcement serves as a stark warning to the West. But what's behind this sudden escalation? Is it mere posturing, or is there a genuine threat that Russia could unleash nuclear chaos if Western boots, such as those from France, land on Ukrainian soil? Strap in as we dive into the dark heart of this nuclear standoff to uncover the truths that lie behind the surface. Let's unravel the reality behind Russia's nuclear threats. Russia's Ministry of Defense said the exercise will be done to practice the issues of preparation and use of non-strategic nuclear weapons. Non-strategic or tactical nuclear weapons have no official definition, but they are generally low-yield arms of shorter range designed to be used against enemy forces on the battlefield rather than against large population centers. They are often forward-deployed to bases and may come in the form of not just bombs, but torpedoes, artillery, or even mines. Russia has about 1,558 tactical nuclear weapons, according to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. While it is modernizing these weapons, NATO's conventional superiority and Western military aid are challenging Russia's position. Despite mounting losses in Ukraine and strategic disadvantages, Moscow's emphasis on its nuclear forces highlights its struggle to maintain parity. The resilience and strategic advancements of Ukraine, supported by Western technology and aid, continue to pose significant challenges to Russia. Russia's tactical nuclear weapons include an estimated 784 in its navy. These come mostly in the form of cruise missiles. There are about 334 in its air force, mostly delivered by bombers, though some fighter aircraft, like the Su-57, are also thought to be capable of using them. The remainder consists of ground-launched missiles. The nuclear exercises will include missile forces in Russia's southern military district, which is headquartered at Rostov-on-Don, and covers the battlefields in eastern and southern Ukraine. The Russian Navy and aerospace forces will participate in the drills. But why would Russia resort to an exercise in the use of these weapons at this particular time? After all, 2024 has mostly been good for the Russian cause in Ukraine, if you count minor territorial gains at the cost of tens of thousands of casualties to be a good thing. These results were good enough for Vladimir Putin, at least, for him to be re-elected as the president of Russia with no difficulty. So the idea that Russian elites dissatisfied with the war would oust him from power is a more distant prospect now. But the summer might be better for Ukraine. Russia has only been as successful as it has this year because of Ukraine's ammunition shortages. In April, Christopher Cavoli, the highest-ranking American general in Europe, mentioned that Russia was firing 5 times as many shells as Ukraine. That's now about to change. In February, the Czech Republic announced that it had identified 800,000 available artillery shells in non-Western countries. The next month, the Czechs found an additional 700,000 shells. Western powers soon began purchasing both sets. In the next couple of months, these shells will arrive in bulk on the Ukrainian battlefields. In April, the United States Congress passed an aid package for the first time in 6 months. Worth $61 billion for Ukraine in total, the bill includes $14 billion worth of weapons and ammunition shipments for the Ukrainian military, including artillery shells and ATACMS missiles. These developments put much further pressure on the Russian military, and on April 21st, the Institute for the Study of War suggested that it would try its best to make the most of the closing window of opportunity. Russian forces will likely intensify ongoing offensive operations and missile and drone strikes in the coming weeks in order to exploit the closing window of Ukrainian materiel constraints. To add to the notion of a closing window of opportunity for Russia, Western leaders have been more adamant in their rhetoric that Putin's invasion not be allowed to succeed, even if it means loosening the constraints on the Ukrainian military. French President Emmanuel Macron was the most prominent such leader. In February, shortly after the fall of Avdiivka, he refused to rule out the idea that Europe should send troops to Ukraine. Macron argued that other taboos had not been broken before. Many people who say never never today were the same people who said never tanks, never planes, never long-range missiles 2 years ago. Let us have the humility to note that we have often been 6 to 12 months late. If you're a regular viewer of us here at the Military Show, then you know that truth is often stranger than fiction. But what do you do when you need a way to keep track of both? Well, we've found a solution, and that's why we're so excited to tell you about the sponsor of today's video, World Anvil. Designed to support creators from all walks of life, whether you're a writer, artist, streamer, game designer, historian, or hobbyist. Their powerful tools help you break down, organize, visualize, and plan out your creative endeavors. with features like interactive maps, chronicles, timelines, and newly enhanced diplomacy webs. Are you an RPG game master? World Anvil supports over 45 systems including D&D 5e, or you can create your own. While players will love World Anvil's extensive character management system, featuring character sheets, journals, inventory management, and spellbooks. But what if you're a writer who wants to create your own universe? With 25 world-building article templates, you can create wiki-style presentations of your world, making it easier than ever to write, organize, and even publish your stories. What we found most impressive, though, are the interactive maps and chronicles feature that allow you to plot events across time and space, truly bringing your narrative to life. Plus, with the new major update to timelines, organizing complex scenes, scenarios, and events has never been simpler. Ready to start forging your own world? Just go to worldanvil.com or use the link in the description, and be sure to use the code MilitaryShow to get 51% off any yearly subscription, giving you access to all the incredible features World Anvil has to offer. Again, that's worldanvil.com and use the code MilitaryShow to start exploring, creating, and sharing with World Anvil right now. Macron also mentioned in his recent appearances that Russia was the sole aggressor and that Europe would need to do whatever it could to ensure that it did not come out of the war as the victor. More recent comments by other leaders suggested that the West's attitude was shifting toward letting the Ukrainians be more aggressive with the weapons they received. On May 2nd, British Foreign Secretary David Cameron promised nearly $4 billion of annual unilateral aid to Ukraine for as long as the war would last. Importantly, he added that Britain would have no problem with Ukraine using British weapons to attack targets on Russian soil. He said that such a move would be part of Ukraine's right to defend itself, and particularly appropriate given Russia's conduct inside Ukrainian territory. Such long-range weapons would include the British Storm Shadow air-launched cruise missile, which can hit targets at least 155 miles away, though experts believe they might be able to go longer. These weapons are ideal for striking vital military assets deep behind enemy lines, such as command and control centers or supply depots. Ukraine has successfully demonstrated its ability to use these missiles in Crimea as part of a campaign that has forced the Russian Black Sea Fleet to retreat from its traditional base at Sevastopol. Its most notable success was the damaging of the Russian submarine Rostov-na-Donu on September 23rd. On April 23rd, the British government pledged additional Storm Shadows as part of the largest aid package it ever passed for Ukraine. Worth $622 million in total, the British package includes 1,600 offensive and defensive missiles, including more Storm Shadows. France pledged its version of the Storm Shadow, called Scalp, shortly afterward. As this rhetoric and news of additional Western military aid was heating up, the Russian government warned that the talk of sending NATO troops to Ukraine amounted to a new round of escalation, and in March, Putin said that it would be a short step to World War III from that perspective, a war he insisted no one wanted. In the first half of 2023, NATO also held its largest exercises since the Cold War, called Steadfast Defender, which practiced the deployment and cooperation of all alliance members across the Atlantic and the length and breadth of the European continent. This operation, too, saw a loud protest from Russia. Russia was making incremental and costly gains when Ukraine was suffering a severe shortage of weapons and ammunition. That situation will no longer be the case in the second half of the year, putting much greater pressure on Putin, who can now expect far higher losses. To answer the question of whether Putin would resort to using nuclear weapons in the presence of French troops, as Macron hinted though, we first need to look at Russia's nuclear doctrine. Russia's official nuclear doctrine permits the use of such weapons in the event of an enemy attack using weapons of mass destruction or conventional weapons when the very existence of the state is threatened. Like the American nuclear football, the briefcase with the Russian nuclear launch controls, called the Cheget, is with the President of the Russian Federation at all times. Russia's defense minister and chief of general staff have their own nuclear briefcases. The Cheget allows the president to communicate with the top military commanders and to the related nuclear forces via the Kazbek command and control network. In 2019, Russia's state Zvezda television channel revealed footage of what it said was the Cheget. In a section called Command, there were two buttons, the white launch button and the red cancel button. Like in the United States, the president has the sole authority to order a nuclear attack. If Putin thought that Russia was coming under a serious enough threat, he would be able to send a launch order to the Russian military, which would quickly reach its nuclear forces. If necessary, Russia has a dead hand or perimeter computer network that could carry out the order on an automated basis. Although Russia's official nuclear doctrine would seem to renounce the idea of a first strike, this is not the case. During the 1980s, the Soviet Union adopted an official no first-use policy with regards to nuclear weapons, but this was never truly sincere. For example, the Soviets considered launching a preemptive nuclear attack during NATO's Able Archer 83 exercise. In 1993, the new Russian Federation officially dropped the no first-use policy. Meanwhile, since Russia is a dictatorship anyway, official laws and policy count for little. If Putin wills it, there will be a nuclear strike. There is no countermanding authority that would stop him from launching an attack if he was dead set on it. Indeed, some hardliners in Russia want Putin to loosen the country's nuclear doctrine, although he said last year that he saw no reason to make a change. Putin's latest nuclear comments and news of the exercises were met with relative ambivalence in Ukraine and in the West, as have his other overtures to nuclear weapons since the war began. Andriy Yusov, an official with Ukraine's military intelligence, said that nuclear blackmail is a constant practice of Putin's regime in response. Indeed, such practices have been common since the start of the war. Days after the invasion began, Putin ordered his nuclear forces to be put on a state of special alert. This was likely an attempt to discourage the West from supporting Ukraine with weapons and money. That obviously didn't work. In September 2022, as Russian forces were in retreat in the face of Ukraine's counteroffensives in Kharkiv and Kherson oblasts, Putin boasted that Russia had unrivaled weapons of mass destruction and that he would use any means available to defend the homeland. "I'm not bluffing," Putin insisted. As if to make the matter clearer, Putin decided to deploy some of Russia's tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus in the summer of 2023. Old Soviet bases built for the purpose of hosting such weapons were reactivated. None of these nuclear-related actions had any effect on the war, though, either on the battlefield or on the diplomatic front. This is why Putin's latest round of nuclear saber-rattling hasn't made much of an impression on anyone. But what if Macron followed up on his rhetoric and French troops got involved? Would this unlikely event make Putin's nuclear threats more than just talk? One must admit that the presence of French troops on Ukraine's soil would be a significant new development in the war. How would Putin react? Would he consider it an existential threat? First, we must note that the presence of French troops alone would not necessarily mean the escalation of the war in Ukraine into World War III. NATO is a defensive alliance only. The North Atlantic Treaty does not obligate its members to assist one another if one of them takes part in an overseas expedition on its own initiative. Suppose Macron and the French government decided to send some troops to reinforce Ukraine. That would be a decision from Paris alone. If the French intended to take such unilateral action, they would not be able to rely on their NATO allies to come to the defense of their forces in Ukraine. The lack of involvement from the rest of NATO may convince Putin that Russia is not under existential threat and need not use nuclear weapons in retaliation. There would also be another consideration. Although Russia has isolated itself from much of the world with its decision to invade Ukraine, it nevertheless depends on a series of relationships with other countries in order to keep its economy afloat, its forces supplied, and its society running. Breaking the nuclear taboo would put these relationships under strain. North Korea likely wouldn't care and continue supplying Russia with artillery shells and other weapons, but the relationship with Pyongyang isn't exactly the most important one. Three relationships in particular have been of pivotal interest for a warring Russia. The first of these is with Turkey. Turkey has sold weapons to Ukraine, particularly its Bayraktar TB2 drone. It's also closed the Dardanelles and Bosporus to the ships of the Russian Navy, in line with the 1936 Montreux Convention, preventing the Russian Black Sea Fleet from being reinforced. Nevertheless, Turkey has not been as severe with Russia as the rest of its NATO allies. Turkey has avoided joining the Western sanctions regime and has become the fourth largest customer for Russian energy exports. In the pre-war years, Turkey attempted to use its relationship with Russia as part of a strategy of geopolitical hedging. Despite Turkey's insistence that Crimea be returned to Ukraine and tensions with Russia in Syria, it attempted to maintain good relations. The best example was its decision to purchase the S-400 air defense system, in a move which brought American sanctions and its exclusion from the F-35 program. For Turkey, though, fostering the relationship with Russia was a way to balance against the West. Since the West was opposed to some of Turkey's moves in the Middle East, particularly against the Kurds, hedging with Russia was a matter of strategic importance for the government in Ankara. There are also certain ideological ties. Under the leadership of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Turkey has gone through a period of democratic backsliding and growing authoritarianism. Like Putin, Erdogan has been called a proponent of the civilization state theory, and he has grown Turkey's reach beyond its borders in moves which some experts call attempts at a neo-Ottoman foreign policy. Nevertheless, if Russia were to cross the nuclear threshold, it's hard to see how Turkey would be able to maintain the relationship. In a nuclear scenario, Turkey is particularly endangered, not just because of its geography and its membership in the NATO alliance, but because it hosts American tactical nuclear weapons on its soil. Keeping the nuclear genie in its lamp is in Turkey's best interests, and its failure to mount much greater opposition to Russia in that scenario would force the West's hand in dealing with the so-called odd man out of NATO. Russia using nuclear weapons would force Turkey to choose the West and completely shun Russia for its own economic survival. India is the second critical relationship for the post-invasion Russia. Indian purchases of Russian energy have helped Moscow to weather the storm of Western sanctions, and it's now Russia's third largest customer. India has had a long-running security relationship with Russia as well, with New Delhi keen to purchase weapons such as the S-400 and T-90 tank. However, India has been between something of a rock and a hard place with its relationship with Russia. It's traditionally a non-aligned country, but its primary national security challenge is from a more aggressive China. Such a challenge has drawn India steadily into the American foreign policy orbit, especially through the quadrilateral security dialogue. Deadly border clashes between 2020 and 2022 reinforce the importance of the relationship with the United States. India has so far successfully managed to walk the tightrope between the United States and Russia. Since countering China is also Washington's highest geopolitical priority, it's tolerated India's cozier relationship with Russia. However, all bets would be off in the event that Russia went nuclear in Ukraine. Like Turkey, India would almost certainly be forced to renounce its relationship with Russia for the sake of its trade with the much larger economies of the West and because of its national security interests. And what about China? The relationship with Beijing is by far Moscow's most important. China is now Russia's largest energy customer. It's also a critical source for electronic components and other vital goods that have been targeted by Western sanctions. Russian foreign reserves are now filled with Chinese currency thanks to the exploding trade between the two countries. Unfortunately for Russia, this currency isn't good for much other than trade, and because the economies of the West are now cut off, Moscow must keep trading with China to survive. It can't hedge its bets. China has understood this advantage and used it. Xi Jinping might agree with Putin in his attempts to undermine the US-led international order, but he has so far not been willing to provide military aid for fear of cutting off trade with the West. In the statement following Xi's summit with Putin in 2023, both leaders agreed that all nuclear powers should refrain from deploying such weapons beyond their national borders. Russia's deployment of tactical nukes to Belarus came only months later and may have been an attempt to break the mold that it's now the junior partner in the relationship. Russia's use of these weapons would be a completely different story. If Xi was reluctant to provide military aid for fear of upsetting trade relationships with the West before, Russia's use of nuclear weapons would leave him with little choice but to play a much more forceful hand against Russia. China's economy is already showing signs of trouble. It grew by only 3% in 2022, low by its standards, and has entered a general decline in growth since Xi took power. If Russia broke the nuclear taboo and China refused to join the world in imposing costs for such behavior, it would suffer severely from the severance of relations with the West, which are already under strain. For these reasons, the presence of French troops on Ukrainian soil would not necessarily lead to Putin using nuclear weapons, especially if they are small in number. However, if France launched a full-scale deployment, Russian forces in Ukraine would be in serious trouble. Russia has suffered enormously against a Ukrainian military that it is outnumbered and outgunned. It's reasonable to assume that a better equipped and better trained French force would do far more damage. In the face of Putin potentially being unable to win the war on a conventional basis, the temptation to use tactical nuclear weapons to turn the tide would increase. But France is a nuclear-armed nation, and so Putin would face the awful conundrum of losing the war and losing power, or facing nuclear retaliation and the loss of Russia's most important trading relationships. Hopefully in such a scenario, Russia's elite would decide to pack him off and ship him to an isolated dacha before anything too drastic comes to pass. The prospect of French intervention, especially without its allies, remains unlikely. Nevertheless, Macron's statements and Putin's latest round of nuclear saber-rattling show us how high the stakes are in the game of nations these days. After the end of the Cold War, the people of the world had high hopes that such things were behind them, but history never truly ends. What do you think Putin would do if France or another Western country decided to intervene unilaterally in Ukraine? Could this escalate to crossing the nuclear threshold? And what would be the consequences for Russia even without nuclear retaliation? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more expert military analysis.